Good morning. It's difficult for me to begin without acknowledging the very powerful experience that many of us in this room had at the memorial service just before. This really is, for many of us in this room, something of a transition. The events of this summer in particular, I think, have been weighing on us during the course of the weekend in many, many different ways. And I think it came to the fore very powerfully for me, and I know for many of you during the ceremony, the way that we have come together as a community, largely through our grief. And actually, the Torah verse that I wanted to begin my remarks with today dovetail very well with some of the things that were said during the memorial service. It's a verse that comes from the Exodus story, from the book of Shemot, Exodus 3:9. And it occurs when God is revealing God's self to Moses at the burning bush, and God says, "Now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen how the Egyptians are oppressing them." And that's a remarkable verse on many levels, but apropos of our memorial service, I think it speaks to the way that we are hearkening to the cries of the oppressed in Gaza and Palestine in important, if painful ways. You know, in the story, one of the inscrutable parts of that verse is that this supposedly omnipotent and omniscient God is suddenly only now able to hear the cry. And I think that on one level speaks to all of us. It's really not about God so much as it is all of us finding the wherewithal to hearken to the cry when it reaches a certain point. It's all we can do to open up our hearts to that cry and do something about it. I think also, apropos of so many of the things we've been talking about during the course of the weekend, there's a very profound lesson being taught to us by this verse vis-a-vis liberation movements. It's almost a kind of a physics approach to liberation. Throughout human history, we have seen these moments when the experience of a community's oppression reaches a kind of tipping point. They invariably come when a community's oppression becomes impossible to ignore, when the cry and the outrage becomes too great, when it becomes impossible to look away. And it is at these critical moments, I believe, when the process of liberation inevitably begins. I think of this lesson often when I think about the growth of JVP and the Palestinian solidarity movement over the past few years. It is sobering to contemplate, but it's true. Most of the significant periods of growth of our organization have occurred as responses to devastating human tragedy. We all know how JVP has grown so dramatically in the wake of the tragedy of this past summer. I myself became actively involved in JVP following Israel's military assault on Gaza in 2008-2009. In truth, the growth of our movement has been exponentially linked to the cries of the oppressed, and perhaps it has ever been thus. So during my remarks to you this morning, I'd like to offer a few brief meditations on how we at JVP might take advantage of this moment. And that sounds almost sacrilegious to say take advantage of, but I really mean that in the spirit of how we might not only open our hearts, but move to action as a response to these cries. This is a moment which is so clearly critical in the movement for justice in Israel-Palestine. And specifically speaking, I want to take my cue from JVP's recent strategic plans, and you have these pages in front of you, in which our leadership set organizational goals for the next 3 to 5 years. Don't read them yet, you'll be reading them very soon. It's always a mistake for a speaker to direct people to a piece of paper while he or she is speaking. I'd like to use 2 of the formal goals in particular as a kind of a frame and use them to offer you a few thoughts at this critical juncture for our organization and our movement, and maybe suggest a few thoughts about where the journey might lead us from here. I want to start with goal number 4. Don't have to read it yourself, I'll read it for you. Shifting culture and public discourse. And I'll quote, "Changing the public discourse and shifting cultural understandings of what is happening in Israel-Palestine is a prerequisite for changing policy." In other words, and this is a term we often use at AFSC, we are attempting to change the narrative on Israel-Palestine. I think we all know how central narrative change is to the process of political transformation. Speaking personally, I know how transformative it was for me to embrace a new narrative on Israel-Palestine, and how absolutely key it was to my participation in this movement. It represented a fundamental shift. It meant abandoning, painfully, the liberal Zionist narrative that had been at the center of my Jewish identity for my entire life. And here I just want to read to you briefly a blog post. It comes from my book, by the way, which is on sale in the lobby. I was told at the Just World Books table, only 5 left. So I promised Kim I would make that plug. That was for her, not me. This was a blog post that I wrote a year after Operation Cast Lead, December 28, 2009. And I began, I won't read the whole thing, but I began by quoting the New York Times article about the initial attacks on Gaza City at the beginning of Operation Cast Lead and how it affected me. Previously, when I hear this kind of news out of Israel-Palestine, my shock and anguish would quickly be tempered by a familiar voice telling me to calm down, don't overreact, don't forget how terribly complicated the situation is. This time, however, it was different. This time I didn't hear the voice. Somehow, it just didn't seem all that complicated to me anymore. Ideologically speaking, I've regarded Zionism with great pride as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. Of course, I didn't deny that this rebirth had come at the expense of another people. Of course, I recognized that Israel's creation was bound up with the suffering of the Palestinians. The situation was, well, it was complicated. Last year, however, I reacted differently. I read of Apache helicopters dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on 1.5 million people, crowded into a 140 square mile patch of land with nowhere to run. In the coming days, I would read about the bombings of schools, whole families being blown to bits, children literally burned to the bone with white phosphorus. Somehow, it didn't seem complicated at all anymore. At long last, I felt as if I were viewing the conflict with something approaching clarity. Of course, I think we'd all agree that the Israel-Palestine conflict is technically complicated. But at the end of the day, there is nothing complicated about persecution. The political situation in Darfur, for instance, is enormously complicated. But these complications certainly haven't stopped scores of Jews across North America from protesting the human rights injustices being committed there. We do so because we know that underneath all the geopolitical complexities, oppression is oppression. And as Jews, we know instinctively that our sacred tradition and our own tragic history require us to speak out against all oppression committed in our midst. I'd suggest that if there is anything complicated for us here, it is in the possibility that we might in fact have become oppressors ourselves. That is painfully complicated. After all, our Jewish identity has been bound up with the memory of our own persecution for centuries. How on earth can we comprehend, let alone respond, to the suggestion that we become our own worst nightmare? More than anything else, what I was trying to say in that anguished, emotional blog post 1 year ago was this. Is this what it has come to? Have we come to the point where Israel can wipe out hundreds of people, whole families, whole neighborhoods, and our response as Jews will be simply to rationalize it away? At the very least, will we be able to stop and question what has brought us to this terrifying point? Have we become unable to recognize persecution for what it really and truly is? Those who know me or read my blog surely know that it has been a painfully challenging year for me. My own relationship to Israel is changing in ways I never could have predicted. Since I started raising questions like those above, I've lost some friends, and yes, my congregation has lost some members. If Zionism is the unofficial religion of the contemporary Jewish community, then I'm sure there are many who consider me something of an apostate. But at the same time, I've been surprised and encouraged by the large number of people I've met who've been able to engage with these questions openly and honestly, even if they don't always agree with me. I suppose this is what I decided to do 1 year ago, to put my faith in our ability to stand down the paralyzing complexities, however painful the prospect. 1 year later, I still hold tight to this faith. When I wrote back then that my relationship to Israel had changed in ways I never could have predicted, I was openly acknowledging that my accepted narrative had shifted, and it led to life changes that are still ongoing for me. It certainly transformed the way I saw myself as a Jew and how I would do my work as a congregational rabbi. But on a deeper sense, I think this narrative change transformed me at what I can only call a spiritually cellular level. It challenged me to reckon with the meaning of solidarity in its truest and most universal form. It reaffirmed that lesson that comes straight from the heart of the Exodus story, the story that teaches God hearkens to the cries of the oppressed and demands that we do the same. And it empowered me to speak my truth in unprecedented ways, as I put it in that blog post, to stand down the paralyzing complexities no matter how painful the prospect. I've also come to believe that narrative change is not only true on the personal level, but on the political level as well. We know from experience that narratives that were formerly unthinkable can eventually become all too politically real. A big part of the challenge is learning how best to articulate our discourse, understanding when, where, and in what ways it can be most effective. We've been talking at length about these kinds of issues this weekend. The most challenging place to do this narrative-changing work, I think we would all agree, is within the mainstream Jewish community. And that brings me to goal number 1, challenging institutional communities. Again, I'll quote, "We are challenging institutional Jewish communities to act on values of justice, and we are paving the path toward justice-centered Jewish communities." Having made a home in the institutional Jewish community for my entire life, my entire adult life, I should say, I will say that I do believe there's important work to be done in engaging the Jewish establishment on this issue. When I started doing Palestinian solidarity work openly and unabashedly, I had been working in my congregation in Evanston for 10 years. And I take great heart in the fact that for the following 10 years, I was supported by my congregational leadership and by the majority of my congregants, even when many didn't agree with me. So yes, I believe there are indeed signs that we are seeing a nascent paradigm shift in the Jewish community on this issue. Open Hillel is providing us with an inspiring and important model of how to fight for a wide Jewish communal tent. This past summer, if not now when, showed us magnificently what principled Jewish communal dissent might look like. I don't think it's a coincidence that both of these initiatives have been organized and led by young people, and this should give us very real hope for the future. For the future of this discourse in the American Jewish community. At the same time, however, I don't have any illusions about the ability of the Jewish establishment to be pushed to act on values of justice when it comes to Israel-Palestine. I have many rabbinical and Jewish professional colleagues who must remain in the closet about their work with JBP, because to make their affiliation public would constitute a very real professional risk. There are actually JBP members at this very gathering who have to wear stickers on their nameplates that say "no photos please" for fear that they might endanger or lose their jobs. And this is, to me, just mortifying to even have to say something like that out loud, but it's very, very real. So at the end of the day, I think we need to be realistic about the challenge before us when we talk about engaging the mainstream Jewish community on the issue of Israel-Palestine. It will be a daunting and perilous task. I think in many cases there are areas of low-lying fruit in the Jewish community that we would do well to engage. But frankly, on a strategic level, we need to be honest about how much time, energy, and resources we want to spend trying to be involved in the Jewish institutional community on the issue of Israel-Palestine. Actually, when it comes right down to it, I'm much more excited about the second half of that goal number 1 that I just read you. We are paving the path toward justice-centered Jewish communities. In this regard, I was so pleased and excited to hear Rebecca Vilkomerson talk during the opening plenum and Cecily Saraski last night about the ways that JBP is creating a new and unprecedented form of Jewish community. I agree with them 100%. And so for the remainder of my remarks, I'd like to try to explore what a justice-centered Jewish community might look like. I'd like to suggest a vision that is fundamentally, perhaps radically different than our customary notions of Jewish communal life. I'd like to read to you an excerpt now from a sermon I gave on Rosh Hashanah 3 years ago entitled Judaism Without Tribalism. Now don't worry, it's like, oh my God, he's going to read to you from his high holiday sermon. If it's any consolation, this, probably more than any sermon I ever gave, pissed off a lot of people. Shows the kind of bubble I've been living in, I guess, the last several years. I didn't expect it to be taken as hard as it was by as many people. But also, of many of the sermons that I've written in recent years, this one really speaks to my heart in a very direct way. So I'm quoting. I know personally how hard it is for many of us to challenge our tribal Jewish legacy. As for me, I believe to my very core that whether we like it or not, our collective future will depend on building more bridges and not more walls between peoples and nations. I believe the most effective way for us to survive, the only way we will bequeath our traditions to the next generation, is to affirm a Judaism that finds sacred meaning in our connection to Kol Yoshvei Tevel, all who dwell on earth. I also believe this because I know that while Judaism certainly contains tribal and parochial teachings, it also has a strong tradition of religious humanism, mitzvot that demand that we love all our neighbors as ourselves. After all, one of the first and most powerful teachings in Torah is that human beings are created b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God. From the outset, we learn that all human beings are equally worthy of respect, dignity, and love, and I would add, equally worthy of one another's allegiance and loyalty. Moreover, a key rabbinic concept, kavod habriot, demands that we ensure all people are treated with honor and dignity. In a famous verse from the classic rabbinic text, Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Ben Zoma teaches, "Who is honored? The one who honors all human beings." All are created in God's image. Honor comes to the one who honors all people. To my mind, these are the strands of Judaism we must seek out and affirm in no uncertain terms. In this day and age, when the fates of all peoples are becoming so very deeply intertwined, I believe we must consider values such as b'tselem Elohim and kavod habriot to be among the most sacred of our tradition. Perhaps we can also take our cue from these values in order to affirm a new kind of tribalism, to forge tribal connections with others not simply because they happen to be Jews, but because they share our values of justice and equity. In other words, I believe our ultimate loyalties should lay with the powerless, the vulnerable, the marginalized, and all who fight on their behalf. Whether they happen to be Jewish or not. Whether they happen to be Jewish or not, why shouldn't we consider these to be the members of our most cherished tribe? Here's a personal example. As a rabbi, I do a great deal of work with clergy, both inside and outside the Jewish community. And over the years, I've come to notice that the most meaningful and important community work I do is not necessarily exclusively with other rabbis. When it comes to the values I hold most sacred, values of social justice, human rights, community service, I find myself working and finding common cause with clergy of many different faiths. Some may be Jewish, some not, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. These are the ones I consider to be my primary faith colleagues, my primary clergy community. In one sense, then, perhaps our most sacred religious values actually compel us to look past the feelings of Jewish tribal loyalty. Needless to say, if we're going to do this on a communal scale, it's going to take a radical shift in consciousness. We're going to have to step out from behind the walls we built and understand many of our real sisters and brothers have been there all along. And we will have to recognize that in the end, their hopes, their dreams, and their suffering are irrevocably connected to ours. I have no illusions that it will be a simple matter for the Jewish community to heed such a call. Having only recently emerged from the ghetto, still living with a collective memory of anti-Semitism, still reeling from the trauma of the Holocaust, it is no small matter to go beyond our own fears and feel the pain of the other as our pain as well. Our tent in new and creative ways. Perhaps we can start here with a reconsideration of the Jewish value of Ahavat Yisrael, love of the Jewish people. What do we really mean when we use this term. Certainly it might mean an abstract sense of connection and kinship with other Jews throughout history and around the world. And it's true. We do feel a special connection to Jews we meet in unlikely places throughout the world. It is also quite powerful to know that the words we pray and study are the same words Jews have prayed and studied for centuries. But beyond this, what do we mean by Ahavat Yisrael? What does it mean to love a culturally constructed community that includes people with whom we may or may not share basic fundamental values? In truth, the definition of who is a Jew has always been disputed, and what we call the Jewish community is more diverse and dynamic today than ever before. It is also increasingly enriched by the participation of many non-Jews who are marrying into our community. So what do we mean when we talk about love of the Jewish people, when the very truth of our peoplehood is so complex and ever-changing? I'd like to suggest that a deeper understanding of this value shouldn't stop at love just for fellow Jews. After all, while the word Yisrael does refer to the Jewish people, it also literally means one who wrestles with God. Seen thus, we might render Ahavat Yisrael as love for all who struggle. To love all who fight, as we have, for freedom and justice and tolerance in the world. To stand in solidarity with those who struggle against tyranny and are beaten, imprisoned, tortured, or killed for doing so. To throw our allegiance to those who wrestle deeply for meaning in their lives, who seek to tear down the limits of religious dogma or ideological coercion. These are the members of our tribe, perhaps our most sacred tribe. And whenever we reach out to them and celebrate our inherent connection with one another here, around the world, or throughout history, that is when we fulfill the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael. I realize that this new understanding might seem like radical change to many, but in truth, the Jewish world is changing as it has from time immemorial. The only question before us is, will we have the courage to recognize these changes and to see them as a precious opportunity rather than as a threat to be fought at all costs? So I am no longer a congregational rabbi, and it's actually not all that funny. I didn't mean it that way. I'm not part of the establishment the mainstream Jewish community anymore, and there is and maybe always will be a part of me that mourns that. At the same time, leaving my congregation made it clear than ever before that JVP and the movement that JVP is a part of, the larger solidarity movement of which we are a part, really is my most sacred community, my primary spiritual community, as I indicated in those remarks. We are creating something wholly different that's not based on tribal assumptions of Judaism, which is not based on nation-statism or political affiliations, but are based on sacred values. We are all together as part of this tribe, and it has been so deeply heartening for me to look up and see all these people who are part of this community. I learned from so many of you. It is my honor to do this very, very sacred and important work with many of you, with all of you. If there was ever any doubt in my mind, I think one of those turning point moments came for me this past summer when, like all of you, I was in deep anguish about what was going on in Gaza. And I an action of the Chicago Federation fundraising dinner that was supporting the war effort. And I knew that given what was going on at the time, it would be, on one level, kind of crazy to participate in this. I wasn't actually one of the disruptors, I'll say, but I was in the room tweeting what was going on and connecting folks to one another. I was part of the JVP Chicago disruption action that were ongoing across the country at that time. And I want to give a shout out, by the way, because they're in this room, to Lisa Kasowski, Lynn Pollack, Ben Lorber, and Michael DeHeeger, who were among the very brave folks. Oh, and Kirsten, I'm sorry. You know, it was the moment in which I felt I was reclaiming my Judaism. I was sitting in that room filled with members who were purporting to speak for the Jewish community and cheering on the carnage that was going on as we spoke. And I was feeling deeply grieved and deeply pained and just wanted to turn around and run out of the room. And when these fabulous folks stood up, when Rob Emanuel and Michael Warren were speaking, and they pointed at them and said, "We are Jews, shame on you." I really felt that my Jewish soul was being handed back to me. And that's not hyperbole. That was a moment in which I knew that I still had a sacred community to be a part of. And that is just a little microcosm, I think, of what everybody in this room is feeling about this organization. We're creating something new, we're creating something enormously important and unprecedented, and the world needs us, I think, most clearly, not just the Jewish world, but the world. We are here to come together to chart our course together. You'll receive now instructions about how to go forth and do that. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you for offering me a place to hang my Jewish hat. And I look forward to going from strength to strength together. Thank you so much.